Spells have been a long-time inclusion in Hearthstone, functioning basically as standalone effects that don't have a body attached to them. Unfortunately, not every spell in the game has been competitively viable, with a few really missing the mark. In today's list, we'll be doing something a little bit differently by taking a look at the worst spells from each of the 10 classes in the game. And at number 10, we have Recycle for the Druid class. This 6-mana spell lets you target an enemy minion and shuffle it into your opponent's deck. This card has aged really poorly, and for a single target removal spell, Recycle is pretty much the worst deal you can get in Hearthstone. You see, back in the day, a pretty reasonable price for a single target removal, which lets you choose and destroy an enemy minion, was pretty squarely set at 5 mana. The idea behind that being that even though you weren't paying a lot of mana for it, assassinating any late game card put you at a net mana advantage. But as the power of the cards went up, the value of single target removal dropped significantly. For one, most aggro decks became really good at swarming the board, which meant that single target removal was almost useless in those matchups, while control decks started running more minions which generated immediate value from battle cries than from staying on the board. So why is Recycle on this list when nearly identical cards like Entomb have seen a lot of play in the past? Well, despite being a really good form of removal which doesn't trigger death rattles, Recycle doesn't fully destroy your opponent's minion and only delays the inevitable. Whereas Entomb could be used to destroy and steal one of your opponent's late game threats to use for yourself, there's always the chance that your opponent could immediately draw and replay the minion that you just recycled. The problem is especially noticeable when playing any control druid deck, since it gives your opponent way more time to find the threat that you just removed. Pretty much the only reason this card isn't even lower on this list is because it was printed in Druid, which has historically had some of the worst single target removal spells in the game. Even to this day, Druid still only has a handful of true removal spells, making Recycle potentially one of the better options if there's ever a single must-kill target in the meta. And if Blizzard ever decided to do another round of buffs to old cards, I'm sure a buff to 4 mana could make it an interesting removal for control druids and keep it in line with the cost of other conditional removal spells. Unfortunately, one card had to be picked as the worst spell in Druid, since, as surprising as it sounds, basically every single other Druid spell has seen some play at one point. And when Recycle is getting compared to cards which have all seen competitive success, it really is the best worst spell out there. And at number 9, we have Purify for the Priest class. This 2-mana spell requires you to silence a friendly minion to draw a card from your deck. Yes, you heard that right. In order to draw a card for 2 mana, this card requires you to wipe the text off of one of your own minions. And as you can probably guess by the fact that this card's on this list, silencing one of your minions is almost always a bad idea. The way silence effects work in Hearthstone is that it gets rid of friendly enchantments, buffs, and its card text so that it's basically a vanilla minion. And while your opponent could cast negative buffs on your minions, these effects are extremely uncommon in Hearthstone, so its use as a way to cleanse your minions almost never happens. There is one use for Purify though, and that's in Silence Priest decks. This extremely niche deck basically tries to silence their own minions, which are all overstated but have terrible drawbacks. The thinking goes that if you can play a ton of cheap, useless minions early, and remove their text, you can smash your opponent with huge, cheap threats. And while this strategy sounds good when it hits, a Silence Priest basically requires you to invest 2 cards per minion, which means it very quickly runs out of steam. And at 2 mana, Purify would basically erase any mana advantage you would have gotten from silencing your own minions, even if it did replace itself. Purify was basically tied down to a bad archetype, because no other priest deck wanted to silence their minions' great effects off. Purify basically never saw any play. And although Blizzard has technically printed a ton of cards for this deck, Purify is mostly played as a meme card for people to try to dispute how bad of a card it is. It could be reduced down to 1 mana, since it would actually be a decent support card for Silence Priest, but I think Blizzard would rather print a new card to preserve Purify's meme status, as a nearly useless card tied to an awful deck. And at number 8, we have Explorer's Hat for the Hunter class. This 2-mana spell gives a minion +1/+1 and adds a new copy of Explorer's Hat to your hand after the minion dies. This card basically acts like a second hero power, since it re-adds itself back to your hand, but is worse in basically every way. For one, while every other hero power can be played each turn regardless of board state, Explorer's Hat requires you to control a minion to be playable and will only return to your hand once it dies. And for an effect that costs about 0.5 mana, you're going to be overpaying for it basically every time you play it, just so you can have an infinite card. And if your opponent ever happens to feel threatened by Explorer's Hat, they always have the option of silencing or transforming the minion it's cast on to completely delete the hat from the field. This card really only does well in Arena, which is a slow, low synergy format where players draft cards to make their deck, since Explorer's Hat does have the potential to generate enough advantage to win a game. The main reason why it's not lower on this list is because that continuous +1/+1, which is comparable to the Druid hero power, can also save you when you and your opponent are both running low on cards. But other than that, it's been completely outclassed by Libram of Hope, which on the surface does have the exact same effect as Explorer's Hat, but can have its cost permanently reduced to 0 with the help of Libram support cards. Players have tried to make it work in Spellhunter decks as a way to increase the number of spells you cast for the game for Yogg-Saron, but again, there are so many better and cheaper options out there that don't require minions to work that it's hardly ever worth considering. I could see Blizzard one day buffing Explorer's Hat to give +2/+1, but it's in a weird place right now because any slight number changes could make it either broken or even more useless than it is right now. And speaking of cards, which could go infinite, and at number 7, we have Headcrack for the Rogue class. This 3-mana spell deals 2 damage to the enemy hero, but can add a new copy of itself to your hand if you played another card this turn. This card may have seemed good 5 years ago, but even by classic Hearthstone standards, Headcrack is literally just a worse version of the Hunter hero power. So not only does it cost a ton more for an effect that costs about 1 mana, it also requires you to have played another card that turn if you want it to return to your hand, meaning it isn't a truly infinite card. Headcrack also doesn't really fit well with the Rogue class identity either. Compared to other classes, Rogue decks specialize in generating insane amounts of tempo and quickly executing one-turn kills and not in controlling the board and slowly grinding their opponent out. In fact, ever since Alpha, I can only remember there being a single viable control deck out there, but even that deck tried to end games as quickly as possible. And for as clunky as this card is, it is remarkably similar to Ignite, which is a card that made some of the best decks in Standard and Wild possible. That card lets you deal 2 damage to any target, shuffle itself back into your deck, increase its damage each time it was cast, and only cost 2 mana. Aside from tweaking the numbers on Headcrack, one of the huge killers for it is that it returns itself to your hand at the start of your next turn, meaning you can't even use it for any significant burst potential. Instead, you'll just be stuck overpaying for a niche effect each turn that just about every modern deck can punish you for. I'm sure that if this card was printed in a more control-y class, like Mage or Warrior, it could have probably seen more experimentation. As similar as it is to Explorer's Hat, the only reason why it's lower is because of the awful combo condition that only lets you play it once per turn. I think if they just added itself back to your hand each time you played it, it could be a very niche win condition for a heavy control deck, meaning it wouldn't be useless if you didn't have the cards, or have cards you don't want to play that turn. And at number 6, we have Void Contract. This 8-mana Warlock spell destroys half of each player's deck when played. Yes, at a mana cost comparable to that of a legendary Warcraft character and game-changing effects, this 8-mana spell offers a terrible low-tempo effect that affects both players. And before you ask if destroying your deck is as good as it is in other card games, no it isn't. You see, in Hearthstone, destroying cards in your deck effectively deletes them from existence, meaning it won't add cards to your res pool. Destroying cards doesn't even count as discarding them either, meaning Void Contract doesn't even get to benefit from a lot of very decent discard synergies out there. In fact, only a handful of cards actually benefit from having few cards left in your deck, but they don't even require you to have destroyed cards in your deck. You also don't get the option to selectively choose which cards get destroyed either, meaning it's up to pure luck if the win condition is still left in your deck or if it gets Thanos or not. And with so much of Hearthstone relying on card synergy, it's hard to even understand what the purpose of Void Contract is, even 10 expansions later. The main issue is that it's just terrible for tempo. You either play it and have basically spent 8 mana on an effect that doesn't impact the board, or it'll get so little value later on in the game where it only burns a couple of cards for 8 mana. Unlike most of this list though, Void Contract did land itself in probably the best class for it, since Warlocks naturally draw a ton of cards and are less affected by it. Warlocks are also really well known for having some of the best ultra late game control decks, routinely running some of the heaviest value-centered decks in the game. And during those games where each side can afford to play their late game tech cards, it is possible to play Void Contract without immediately losing the game. But just because a card is able to be carried by other broken cards in its class, still doesn't mean it's good. Void Contract could honestly have its cost reduced all the way down to 4 mana if it needed, since at the end of the day, it'd still be a 4 mana spell that doesn't do anything immediately. Or they can go with the Miracle Growth option and tack on a big effect like drawing a couple of cards or dealing damage to both players, just so that it had another less niche use. And at number 5, we have Holy Light. This 2-mana Paladin spell simply restores 8 health to your hero. This card is terrible, and for the reasons you'd guess. It basically has no flexibility, synergy, or use cases other than for just healing your hero. All of the cards from this point onwards are very bad, and we're starting to get to the point where we're ranking cards by how likely it is for them to have any use. If you've seen other videos on this channel, you know how much we hate pure healing effects, and for good reason. Barring extremely large or efficient healing cards, Small to medium heals are almost always useless because they can go -1 in card advantage for a resource that doesn't immediately help you kill your opponent. And while it could be argued that a well-timed small heal can save a game, there are so many other scenarios out there where a card like Holy Light would just be a dead card if you ever drew it, that it's not even worth considering. Against combo and control decks, a medium heal like Holy Light will never be played, do nothing to address your opponent's threat, or slightly stall your opponents before they inevitably finish you off. Even against aggro decks, which is the ideal matchup, aggro decks nowadays can burn through more than 50 health without stopping, and have enough refuel to draw through their entire deck. And that's another one of the main problems with healing. It doesn't stop your opponent from beating you down, it just lets you stall until your opponent runs out of steam. Just about the only saving grace for this card is that since it was printed in the classic set, it's actually possible to wish for it by Zephyros during desperate times. This card, given that you have no duplicate cards in your deck, looks at the board state, generates 3 perfect cards from the classic set for you to choose from to best help you win the game. Other than generating off of Zeph though, no one actually plays Holy Light, so I could see it getting another full rework. One way I could see them making this card stronger is by letting it target minions, and excess healing could be turned into a health buff. That way it could be used on minions too. But as of now, Holy Light definitely deserves to be called the worst paladin spell in the game for being so situational. And at number 4, we have Shatter. This 2-mana mage spell, when cast, will let you destroy a minion, but only if it's frozen, which is a mechanic which will skip the affected character's next turn. This card, as you might be able to tell, is literally useless unless one of your opponent's minions happens to be frozen, which is not that common of an effect, I might add. Of all the mage cards out there that can freeze, a very decent amount of them also deal damage to the targets and can kill minions quite easily without the need of another card to destroy it. And while mage doesn't have access to a ton of hard removal spells, they do have access to a lot of efficient removal spells that make the relatively cheapness of Shatter irrelevant. That's not even mentioning the fact that you likely have to invest another card to pair with Shatter, meaning you're always investing 2 cards to kill 1 minion. Sadly though, Shatter got the short end of the stick, since most other cheap situational single target removal spells have been pretty good. In fact, most of the time their drawbacks are hardly noticeable and can sometimes be an upside. But again, because of how rare it is to actually want to both freeze and destroy a minion, it ends up finding almost no good use cases. Typically, once a minion is frozen, no matter how big it is, it's taken care of for a turn, you don't have to worry about it. And while individual freeze effects are quite rare, there are a lot of ways to refreeze a big minion over and over again to the point where it might as well have been considered destroyed. Shatter suffers a ton from being printed during a time when Freeze Mage was a very dominant deck, so to compensate, Blizzard held back on its power level. Nowadays, they can print a board wipe version of it or a 1-mana version that can also freeze and no one would bat an eye. I think Blizzard could try one more time to make Shatter work, since these versions basically see no competitive play either. Unfortunately, if Shatter could destroy frozen heroes, it would probably be one of the best cards of all time. But if it could also destroy your opponent's weapon, I think it would be quite interesting. After all, it is called Shatter, and it could be interesting as a spell version of Acidic Swamp Ooze. But as is, the only cool thing about it is its artwork. And at number 3, we have Blur. This 0-mana Demon Hunter spell prevents your hero from taking any damage until the end of your turn, and basically gives your hero immune. And despite giving your hero arguably one of the best keywords out there, Blur offers pretty much no value even in the best scenarios. You see, the whole idea behind this card is that after your hero attacks a minion, Blur saves you from taking damage that you would have otherwise taken, which is basically just a more complicated way to heal. And while you do always have ways to attack using the Demon Hunter hero power, you also usually have a weapon equipped for you to be able to kill anything with your attacks. The best case scenario with Blur is that you get to attack a ton of times with glaives in a single turn and save a lot of health. But if you're able to make this play to begin with, you probably would have won without Blur. And like with most of the cards on this list, while you were able to effectively save a ton of health for 0 mana, it still costs you to draw into your hand and it takes a deck slot, which would have been better served by, well, just about any other card. What makes it especially funny is that Blur is almost entirely redundant, since Demon Hunter is strangely one of the best classes in the entire game at healing. Between all the different ways to give your hero minions and spells lifesteal and buff them, it's honestly really easy to stay at high health even in most aggro Demon Hunter decks. But if Blizzard wanted to make Blur slightly less useless and match the power levels of other strong 0-mana cards, they could let it also give your hero a +1 attack. That way you don't have to invest more mana to utilizing its already niche effect. Blur is ultimately pretty outclassed, and given that Demon Hunter has historically been given the best class cards in the game, it stood out so much worse compared to them that we just had to put it at number 3. And speaking of nearly useless 0-mana spells, and at number 2 we have Ancestral Healing. This 0-mana shaman spell lets you restore a minion to full health and gives it taunt, which forces all enemies to attack it. This card is just simply terrible and is a dead draw in just about every deck that it's included in. And if you thought small healing effects were useless, wait until you hear about small healing effects for minions. At least when you're healing your hero, you can usually time it so that you get its full effect off since your hero has relatively high maximum health of 30. Minions, on the other hand, basically cap off at 12 health, with most of them having about 3 health. And while you consider that 1 health minions can't even be healed, since they take at least 1 damage for that to happen, you can see why minion healing is so insignificant. For you to see why, let's first consider the Shaman hero power, which has a chance to summon a 0-2 healing totem that heals all of your minions for 1 at the end of each turn. And as a non-single target repeatable heal, it is honestly so much better in just about every scenario that it puts ancestral healing to shame. And when a card is being outclassed by a hero power, which have effects that are marked up by 2 mana, you know it's pretty pitiful. And honestly, on the hierarchy of effects out there, I find it kind of funny how Blizzard seem to pair the 2 most useless effects out there into a single card. For one, minion heals are just useless, especially when there are tons of cards out there that can straight up buff a minion's maximum health instead, no damage required. Taunt is also pretty useless as it's definitely not worth going -1 for. Again, like Holy Light, Ancestral Healing suffers from being too inflexible and too weak even in its ideal case. And while 0 mana spells have historically been very good, I think it's time for this ancient card to finally see some play. In line with this card's theme of healing and buffing, if we were to change it to make it better, I think letting it also give a minion +1/+1 could also let it be used as a proactive play, rather than as a way to just heal your damaged minions. Unfortunately, Ancestral Healing couldn't make it to the top of this list, since the next card is just so incomparably garbage that it just had to take it. And at number 1, we have Dr. Boom's Scheme. This 4-mana warrior spell, when casted, lets you gain exactly 1 armor and will increase it by 1 at the end of each turn, but only if it's in your hand. And if you've never heard or seen of this card before this video, I envy you because this is about one of the worst cards in the entire game. This card takes about just every mistake that makes a card unplayable and lumps them all together into one ungodly mess. For one, at base rate, you're literally paying double the price for half the armor you've gotten from the warrior hero power, and the hero power isn't even that good. And while it does scale as the game goes on, it takes forever to even start being worth running. And that's not even mentioning how you have to draw into it for it to even start upgrading. And fine, maybe I am being harsh, but at the moment, it has basically no niche and is outclassed by a ton of other cards. I do feel for Dr. Boom's Scheme though, since it was originally meant to have the effect of Hagatha's Scheme, but would have been too powerful as a board clear in a warrior class. So how can it be fixed? Well, thematically, all the scheme cards only have 1 effect, start off at 1 of it, and increase by 1 each turn. That means it can't start off at a higher armor amount or scale by more each turn, and barring a full rework of its effect, I think the only number that could be changed to not make it not the single worst spell of the game would be to reduce it to 2 mana, and make it at least comparable to the other armor gain cards Warriors has. Sadly though, 1 card had to be named the single worst spell of the game, and with terrible stats in just about every department, Dr. Boom's Scheme definitely deserves a top spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cards you think we may have missed that should have been on this list, or do you have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments.